Welcome to today's edition of The World Today on Russia's disinformation campaign against the U.S. and its citizens. This edition of The World Today is co-sponsored by Perry Worldhouse and the University of Pennsylvania's Russian and East European Studies Department. Today's discussion could not be more timely, with Russia capturing the headlines almost every day and the associated disinformation pushed out by the Kremlin. For today's program, we welcome Konstantin Borovoi, a Russian politician and entrepreneur, chair of the Western Choice Party since 2013, a former head of the Russian Stock Exchange, and a leader in Russia throughout since the end of the Cold War. He's the author of Russia Against USA, Russia's disinformation campaign against USA and its citizens, the topic of today's discussion. Joining him is Mitchell Orenstein, professor and chair of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, who'll be moderating today's discussion. Thanks to both of you for joining us today. And I will now turn things over to you, and let's have a great event.
Thank you. Konstantin Borovoi, you are free to go ahead and begin your presentation. We're very, very pleased to have you here on behalf of Russian and East European Studies at University of Pennsylvania. We're extremely pleased to have you here today to talk about this timely topic of disinformation. I'm not going to add too much to what Professor Horowitz just said, and please, if you want to jump into your presentation, go right ahead.
Yes, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to give a lecture at your university. I would like to thank everybody, but especially Professor Mitchell Orenstein for this opportunity. So the topic of the lecture is my book, Russia Against USA. I will now turn on my presentation. Just a second. Yes, this is the cover of my book. I'll start with a few words about myself. I'm very well known to the Russian in Russia. I was very well known to the Russian in Russia. This is due to the fact that between 1990 and 1999, I was a source of very unusual for the Soviet Union, for the people of Soviet Union, information about democracy and market economy. Since 1990, I've been very supportive of the initiatives of the West. At the end of just a second, and here is Borovoi in 90s. At the end of Gorbachev's era, I created the largest commercial organization in the Soviet Union, the Russian Commodity and Raw Material Exchange. In 1993, its turnover was $2 billion a day. I was in the Council of Entrepreneurship under President Gorbachev and then President Yeltsin. It was largely thanks to the action of the stock exchange and its brokers that the military coup in 1991 was stopped. At the same time, I headed dozens of stock exchanges, banks, trading houses, television companies, and news agencies. I was the co-host of several programs on radio and television. I have led two political parties, Entrepreneurial Party, Party of Economic Freedom, and after its prohibition, the Western Choice Party. Together with my colleague and friend, well-known dissident and human rights activist Valeria Novodvorskaya, I was the deputy of the State Duma, Russian parliament between 1995 and 2000, and created a parliamentary group called For the Atlantic Dialogue. Here is Novodvorskaya and me on the Red Square, our demonstration against Chechen war. Since 2000, I have been the editor-in-chief of the revived America magazine, which was shut down in 2005. As an editor-in-chief, I was critiqued for my claims that an aggressive anti-Western empire was being resurrected in Russia. I was an active member of anti-Putin opposition until 2019. And when preparation began for another assassination attempt on me, I migrated to the United States. I fled Russia in June 2019. In September, I started several books at once. Actually, the book Russia Against the USSR, Against USA, was completed in 2020, and it's selling now on Amazon. The book is made in form of memoirs. These are my memories and experiences, but I tried to incorporate some research and analysis inside. An attempt to understand and perhaps explain some of their events I witnessed. It's the main theme is, my name theme is KGB activities and activities of its successors in Russia. This is the subject I was working since 1990. The plot of the book revolves around my unsuccessful attempt to warn the FBI in 1999, 2 years before 9/11, about the terrorist attack on the little-known Bin Laden and his little-known organization Al-Qaeda. The message that I brought and handed over the FBI director in October 99 sounded completely crazy. Some organization is planning to torpedo skyscrapers in New York using civilian planes. At the same time, then ambassador in Moscow, his political secretary, and the FBI representative in Moscow took this information very seriously. First, they understood who was telling them about it, and secondly, they knew Russia a little better than even FBI experts in Washington, D.C. I spoke with later. But let me tell this chronologically. In August 1999, Yeltsin and his entourage made a decision about Putin as a successor of Yeltsin. He was appointed prime minister in the Russian government. Before that, he was already the director of FSB. Almost immediately after that, the Second Chechen War began, and the explosions of residential buildings started, and hundreds of people died. The explosion hit in several cities, killing hundreds and injuring thousands, spreading fear across the country. Russian media blamed Chechen terrorists for this bombing. A picture of explosions. In accordance with the Khasavyurt agreement between Russia and Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, January 1st, 2001, the Chechen Republic was to become an independent state. I wasn't friends with first president of Chechen Republic, Johar Dudayev. He was killed in 1996. Even during the war, we met with him several times. I kept in touch with the next president, Ichkeria, Madhadov, and with many influenced Chechens. They were the first to tell me that the Chechen had nothing to do with these explosions. And they explained how the FSB created sort of casus belli in Dagestan to start the Second Chechen War. Putin began to actively campaign to become Yeltsin's successor. The campaign for his promotion was based on the premise that Putin, who was a student of the elite Democrat Anatoly Sobchak and the closest associate of the Democrat Yeltsin, he would continue to build a democratic state of law with market economy in Russia. As a State Duma deputy, together with my political ally, Valeria Novodvorskaya, I oppose this appointment of Putin, a former KGB officer, for the position of the president of Russia. At this time, Anatoly Sobchak returned from his forced immigration. We were friends, and he asked me to meet with him and very actively asked me to support his student Putin. To my objection that it is very dangerous, that he is in no way better than another KGB officer, Primakov, who was trying to reach presidential position. Anatoly Sobchak began to explain that Putin is not a special service officer, but the intelligence agent and intellectual among them. In 1991, Yeltsin said the KGB wasn't a reformed organization and wanted to dissolve it. But in the end, he retained it, divided into separate services: border service, intelligence service, security, FSB, and so on. In August 1999, Putin started the opposite process. The Security Council he created was supported to unite all these services under a single authority. In addition, Putin had decided to service such as to join under his control any military services like GRU. This was the reason why two officers of GRU approached me and reported that they had information about the involvement of FSB officers in the bombing of houses. As a State Duma deputy, I held a press conference on this in the State Duma. At the same time, they told me that they are ready to give me information about the preparation of the terrorist attack on the territory of the United States. There was a lot of information, facts, and names. Yes, press conference in the State Duma. I related this information to the political secretary of the US Embassy in Moscow. She told the US ambassador in Moscow about it, and she asked me to meet with the FBI representative in Moscow. He in turn asked me to meet with some of the senior staff in the FBI in Washington, DC. And I did it when I met them. I didn't see that they were writing down the details about their Russian special services activity. It sounds like nonsense about civilian planes torpedoing New York skyscrapers. You can imagine how it was sounding. I suggested that they open their witness protection program for their GRU agents. But they didn't hear my suggestion about it. Within a year, both GRU agent who transmitted information to me were killed in Russia. Analyzing this meeting, I could have, I understood that the FBI agent were thrown or buffeted, not even by the planes that were torpedoing the skyscrapers, but the suggestion that Russian special service took any part in the preparation of such terrorist attack. The Secret Service of Russia, democratic country, our friends, they said, our hope are in many ways assisting in the terrorist attack against the United States. It's impossible, they thought. That seemed like real nonsense in 1999. In 2003, after the congressional hearing, I took part in I spoke about the resurgence of anti-Western, anti-American empire in Russia. The chairman of the Congressional Security Committee came up to me and said, Konstantin, what do we hate our friend Vladimir Putin for? Is that because you cannot forgive him what he did to your friend, oligarch Michael Khodorkovsky? But the Cold War is long over now. We all won. There is no KGB anymore. I even hired 6 former KGB officers to work in the US Congress Security Committee. I tried to reason him. It wasn't you who hired them, but they recruited you. There is no such thing as former KGB officers. In 2005, at another congressional hearing, I was asked not to be distracted from the main topic when I tried to repeat my thesis about resurrection of the empire in Russia. My consideration, I want to say something that is not in the book. Rather, there is a hint of this, but is not directly stated. From the man who warned the US 2 years before 9/11 about the impending danger, who warned the US in 2005 about the resurgence of anti-Western and anti-American empire. Without any hope of success, I wanted to warn my readers in my book that in the coming years, Russia will face a very dangerous process of disintegration, dangerous for the West and for the whole world. Unlike the disintegration of USSR, where more or less strong central of power remained, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan. Russia now will keep disintegrating in absence of centers of force and power. It's the main warning I want to distribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm supposed to get to the audience questions a little bit later. I have a couple of questions of my own, but I do want to specify. One of them is asking, are you afraid about living in Russia or returning if you're living outside of Russia, and even living abroad, given the long reach of the Putin's regime? And I should have specified at the beginning that Mr. Borovoi is living in Los Angeles since 2019, and indeed was not feeling safe being in Russia. But maybe you want to say a couple more words about that.
From my experience, KGB have no active operation in the United States. A lot of in London, in Europe, but not in the United States. They use country only for the propaganda campaigns. And I think they understand it's dangerous for them if they start any assassinations here, like in London. Because of different reasons, I feel more safe here now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, terrific. Well, we're glad that you feel safe at Perry World House to speak, and are very appreciative of you speaking out on these issues. As you were mentioning, I think a little bit towards the end of your talk, I'm very, very curious personally, and I've studied the sort of security posture of Russia and the approach of Russia towards the West. And it has always seemed to me that Putin was not initially very anti-Western when he came to power in 2000. Maybe he was. Some people think he was, but anyway, he was outwardly friendly to the West at that time. After 2001, he was the first to call to commiserate with President Bush about 9/11 attacks, which you say the FSB might have had a role in. But I've never quite understood what were the factors that caused Putin to turn against the West, and exactly at what time. I can see that it was before the Munich Security Conference in 2007, when he announces to the world that he's against a unipolar world and for a multipolar world. That seems like a turning point. But what was the process that took place that of Putin's progressively becoming anti-Western? Was it something we did? Was it NATO expansion? Was it something he always really held close to his heart? And maybe you can give us your impression.
He was educated by KGB school, and they are working with special people, and they use special scale, special preparation of them. And that's why in the KGB school, they created sort of anti-Western specialists. And the second scale of all KGB officers is their speciality in the propaganda campaign. And he can hide his real views. It's his speciality. I think he was anti-Western from the beginning when he worked in Germany like representative of KGB, ideological department of KGB, 5 department. He was always be anti-Western. He can create image of pro-democratic, pro-market economy person, but I don't think they can, KGB officers, they can play different roles, different characters. And it's another speciality, another scale they can present. I think it's interesting that sometimes I have question about his anti-Semitic conditions. A lot of question about it because sometimes he, for example, from the members of Russian March, he is pro-Jewish president. But it's not so. His teachers was members of KGB during the darkest time, fighting with Jews, anti-Semitic, enormous anti-Semitic campaign in Russia, in Soviet Union, from 1948 till the end of Stalin's era, till 1953. And he can play any role. He is a very smart person. He can be for market economy, against market economy, if you know. He can be supportive by, he can be everything.
So
It's-
in your opinion, then is it am I correct to infer from what you've said to imply that that the expansion of NATO, right, which happened, sort of in 1997, 1999, wasn't a major factor, for Putin in turning against the West?
No, it's subject of for example, Syria. Is it major factor for Putin? No, it was only the case by which he can come to their areas of international areas to become a worldwide political player.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, he doesn't like Assad, I think. He doesn't respect him because of different reasons, but it's very, very convenient instrument to have influence for the international relations.
Mm-hmm.
He's very pragmatic, very pragmatic. I would say, cynic.
A cynic, yeah.
Cynic, yes.
So then how do we understand, in your opinion, Putin's motivations vis-a-vis Ukraine, for instance, today? I mean, do we understand them as that he just wants to exert power basically over the near abroad, that he's kind of an imperialist, or does he believe his rhetoric that the Ukrainian Russians are one people? I mean, what are his kind of motivations? This always seems to be a challenging issue for people in the West to understand.
I think that the main theme, the main goal of his activity is to save power in Russia. And the way to save imperial power is to grow imperial, to expand it, not only Ukraine, but sometimes ago it was Kazakhstan, it was Estonia, it was Latvia, it was Moldova, it was Georgia, by the way. It was in 2008, it was a real war, very active military activity on the territory of neighboring country, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
But the main goal of Putin is to save power, to save his
own rule.
yes, and
Yeah,
his
so
his
basically
money.
your opinion, as you expressed earlier, is that actually Russia faces a prospect of disintegration because of widespread dissatisfaction with what's going on. And in order to preserve his power, he's taking external action to kind of glorify himself and glorify the Russian nation through expansion. Is that the idea?
Yes. On the meeting with director Sakurov, if you know,
Mm-hmm.
it was 2 months ago, he told that now in Russia we have 2,000 points of tension, 2,000. And
Yeah.
it's very dangerous for saving power, to saving country like Union. And now it's very dangerous for him relation with regions,
Mm-hmm.
because it's almost exactly like in the end of the Soviet Union, when Baltic countries started to fight for so-called economic independence.
Mm-hmm.
Hozai, if you remember this word, I don't know how to translate Hozai. Yes, and other countries, Middle Asia countries, Georgia, Armenia, and so on. they were trying to fight for economic independence because Soviet Union cannot survive by itself. It was a way to save local powers for them.
So can I ask another question? It comes from the audience here, about the interference in the 2016 presidential election. So what did that consist of? And again, what are Putin's motivations in that? It seemed confusing to me to some extent, because you would think that if it was a covert operation, they would have wanted to keep it a lot more secret than it was kept. And yet it got traced back to Russia in a pretty extraordinary way. What were the motivations, and what were the actual realities of that?
Motivation for what?
Well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people think, and maybe it's true, or maybe it's not true, that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 American presidential election. Yeah. So I guess the question, first of all, is that true? And if so, what are the motivations for Putin, in authorizing that?
My subject of research last 10 years was propaganda campaign in Russia. And no doubt that propaganda campaign of Russia, of Kremlin, was working to so-called to save elite relations with America, with the United States. And that's why he was strongly against any new tensions inside the United States. And that's why Putin was strongly against, and his propaganda campaign strongly against Donald Trump. And it was very clear for me, because of many aspects of propaganda oriented on the West, Russian propaganda. It's very interesting that it's not very primitive, very direct propaganda. It's very sophisticated one. It's very tricky one. It works like today with some fake opposition's leader. It works like fighting with them, fighting with so-called opposition leader by the way to create new leaders of opposition. It's very tricky. It's a special subject of discussion, special subject of lecture. Let me tell it next time.
Okay, so I understand maybe you'll write a whole extra volume on that alone, and we can talk to you at a later point in time about that issue. Can I ask you, there's a lot of people have different questions right now. Well, there's quite a lot of questions. Yeah, well, this is an interesting one. I don't want to ask you questions that are, easily, like, we can easily look this up on our own, but there's one question here that looks a little harder to which is the question of Putin's net worth, or the Putin's ownership. So one participant asked, can you estimate Putin's ownership interest in Gazprom and Rosneft? And I would maybe add to that, what is his net worth?
Oh, I don't understand your question.
Can you estimate Putin's ownership interest? Like, how much does he own of, say, Gazprom and Rosneft? Or I would say of other things, is it true that he's like a very, very wealthy person? What is your knowledge about that?
Yeah, I know that his ownership is on the level of $1-2 trillion. It's the company one of the biggest trader, which owns by Putin surrounding, costs $250 billion. Only one company. And estimation of his ownership give numbers on the level of $1.5 or $2 trillion.
So in that case, what you're feeling, similar to mine, although I don't know, that even high number shocks me, but that he's the single most wealthy individual in the world. How does that play into his relations with his international relations?
He's trying to save not only his power, but his money, his influence, his structures. And by the way, he is thinking not only about actual conditions, today's conditions, but about future, how to export himself and his surrounding in case of wildfire in Russia. And more of that, I think sometimes they are thinking about how to activate this wildfire for to be more safe without Russia, or to propose support for anybody who want to control very dangerous conditions can happen in Russia after the end of his power. It's very important. I would like to make it one more time. It's very important to research transition conditions after Putin's era, because it can create very dangerous conditions, not only for Russia, but for the neighboring country and for entire world too.
So he's fighting both for his own personal political interests, but also financial interests, in essence.
Yes, he has a family, he has his team, his friends, his supporters. He is thinking not only about himself, but about his team. It's very important to save their power even after disintegration of Russia.
So another question that is raised that's kind of relevant, I think, is it fair to say that Putin is more fearful of neighboring countries that have chosen democracy than he is fearful of NATO? In other words, if democracies such as Ukraine begin to encircle Russia, the Russian people themselves may wonder why they can't have democracy. Do you think that's a greater threat than the threat of NATO?
I don't think that the threat of NATO is really exists in Russia. It's, I would call it the rules of the game. The rules of the game, like with shadow opponents. The rules of the game to save power, to train themselves, to be in good form. Yes, and this is not a real enemy, NATO, and everybody. I remember that President Reagan one time told that they really think that we are, he met Andropov and told that this guy really thought that we want to invade them. It's very funny.
Interesting. Can I, let's see. So another question. Well, actually, I wanted to raise a question since we started talking a little bit about Ukraine. Is I know that you're also have had some dealings with President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I'm just wondering, in this crisis that we have going on now, do you feel that President Zelensky has done a good job? I mean, he's facing many challenges. You know that he was elected kind of unusually in Ukraine as a representative both of the more Russia sympathetic forces and of the Russia opposing forces in Ukraine, right? People who were on kind of both sides of that divide supported Zelensky in his initial election. And now maybe his support has waned a bit, but I mean, it must be very challenging for President Zelensky to deal with this type of problem. Do you think he's done a good job?
Yes, I think so. He's a very honest person. He is very active person. He's from the new generation. He's very young, and his activity now is very effective. His last declaration about address to media, don't panic, don't distribute fear, is very serious, very, by the way, it's very transparent hint for everybody who don't want to support Ukraine, but to create sort of dangerous environment around Ukraine. And the problem of Ukraine has to be resolved by roadmap to NATO, but distributing of weapon, by stop feeding Putin, by money of oil money, but money of for the energy resources. Almost everything was done by Donald Trump.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, like, to me, that different US presidents have had, a lot of challenges and haven't really had a steady position towards Russia. Oftentimes, they come in very friendly towards Russia or wanting to have more friendliness towards Russia, but end up being very confrontational with Russia, which I understand to be in nature. But let's address the same kind of question about President Biden. Do you, when you look at how President Biden has responded to Russia's buildup on the Ukrainian border, sending troops to Belarus, do you believe that President Biden's done a good job in responding to those challenges?
I would say that President Biden is trying to resolve Ukraine problem between Ukraine and Russia with the assistance of Vladimir Putin. It's different way to resolve problems, to use energy of the enemy. It's like in Eastern wrestlings, to use energy of the enemy to resolve, to fight him. I feel something like that, but sometimes I think, I feel that somebody among Joe Biden's team are on the side of Putin, unfortunately.
In what sense on that side?
In sense of Crimea. Crimea was occupied in 2014. I was crying about small little men who are trying to invade
Little green
Ukraine.
men, you mean? Yeah.
Little green man, yes. And the answer, even from CIA, was no, we have no any evidence of this activity of future occupation, no evidence. And from the NATO too, and I have a special chapter in my book about it, about cooperation between White House and Putin's house. Yes,
May I ask
dangerous.
I'm sorry, may I ask you a related question? So my understanding is that to some extent what your response was is that sometimes the Biden administration is too accommodative, is trying to accommodate Putin, and therefore sometimes, you know, basically giving away too much, maybe even being on the same side as, you know, you could look at it that way. So what do you feel about French President Macron's decision to go to Russia and the outcomes of his negotiation? I should preface this by saying I didn't fully research this before, but I just saw that he said that Putin has announced that he's not going to invade, and that's a huge victory. But I just wonder, what is your impression of that type of effort to go and you know, and speak to Putin at this moment?
It's very weak policy and very weak position of Macron. And I think it's dangerous. It looks like political activity before the Second World War, when everybody were trying to reach any agreement with Hitler. And it wasn't very effective. We know it's very dangerous to feed wild animals. The better way now is to support Ukraine, not only by words, by any form of military activity, roadmap to NATO, weapon, because they need to defend themselves, Ukrainians. It's not very honest to leave them alone before Putin.
Yeah.
We have to support Ukraine by any ways.
Right. So another, you know, that's an interesting answer. I mean, so basically, you know, talking to him, that's not going to really do anything except signal weakness. You need to just support Ukraine if he's threatening Ukraine. And I just want to ask you, you mentioned a couple of things also about the Trump-Putin relationship before, which sounds a little different from the typical view about it. But, you know, honestly, the Trump-Putin relationship to me was very, very confusing relationship, right? Because on the one hand, you could see that that Trump was really reluctant to say anything negative about Putin. You in your book mentioned that he's constantly showering Putin with praise, right? Which may have been, I don't know, may have been smart, you know, technique to deal with somebody like Putin, or it could have been weak. It could have been perceived as a weak action. At the same time, a lot of people will point out that, you know, that Putin didn't decide to invade Ukraine during the Trump administration, right? There were also very stern sanctions that came out during the Trump administration on Russia, economic sanctions, and Trump was more willing to provide certain weapons to Ukraine, all of which were elements of, I guess you would say, a sort of stronger response to Russia. So you have this kind of like unusual balance, right, between weaker and stronger approach. And then of course you also have the business deals and the spying, you know, that's alleged, and the campaign outreach, you know. So what do you think about this Trump-Putin relationship? Did they have a relationship, and what was it about? And and how can we understand it, if at all, at the moment?
I think we have answer by Miller Commission.
Mhm.
They had no relations. Putin was looking for Trump around restroom to have any meeting with him, to arrange any meeting with him. It was a very smart strategy. Trump started to compete with Putin on the European market by energy resources.
Mhm.
And just after it was stopped, Russia started to distribute missiles to Middle East immediately. Yes, and I think it was more smart strategy,
Mhm.
more long thinking strategy.
Mhm. So you're talking about Trump's initiative to export US LNG to Europe as a kind of replacement of Russian gas.
Yes,
And so
yes.
that kind of gas diplomacy, so, but aside from that, you're saying also that Trump refused to meet with Putin, actually, but he did meet with Putin several times, right?
A little bit less than President Biden.
So you think that Biden has met with Putin?
Yes, they met, they spoke several times.
Okay.
And I think it was the President Biden's initiative to his address to leaders of NATO countries
Mm-hmm.
to listen Putin, to listen his worries, to listen his, and they immediately got ultimate.
Interesting. So maybe to change it up a little bit, I have an interesting question from Mariana Yorovskaya, or rather, question a little off topic. What studies on Russia's politics do you consider important? Like, what are you reading about Russia that we're not reading, or that you think is important you would recommend?
I don't know, a lot. now it's very very tricky conditions, very unusual conditions for Russia, very transparent, by the way, conditions. And I think the most important thing now is to research Russian conditions, Russian future, Russian development, because any moment, like with the Soviet Union, any moment the process in Russia can start, and it will be very dangerous process. I push a lot of different think tanks to start this research about future the future transition process in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important.
Okay. So that's a good advice for Perry Worldhouse. We need to talk about the future transition in Russia.
Sure.
May I ask another question from the audience? Our students, are very career focused. They want to get jobs. I guess it's normal, right? One asked, do you have any advice for students who want to work on US-Russia relations? For instance, in the field of national security or even academia, we have a program with Russia with the European University of St. Petersburg, a dual degree program. But I think that this student is asking more in the security area. Do you have any advice to people who want to work on US-Russia relations? It's a pretty challenging time in some ways.
And now we've seen more oriented research on US-China relations.
Mm-hmm.
But China is not far from, from Russia. And they are very close, not only geographically, but in their relations, and a lot of problems connected with China can be resolved by relation with Russia, by research of Russia. And the history of relations between Russia and China is very interesting, very productive, and very influenced on the actual conditions, both Russia and China. And maybe it's the most important part of the research, actual relations between Russia and China. For me, it's very interesting last declaration of Putin and Xi Jinping is very interesting document to research. It's about future of human nature. It's interesting, by the way, because they are trying to plan future of the whole world, and they have power to influence on that future.
So you're concerned about that relationship?
Very much.
Yes. I think that one of the people from the audience is asking, I think, a good question. So the book is obviously on disinformation in the US, so perhaps we should return to that issue towards the end here, which is that, does Russia have a sustained disinformation campaign against the US? If so, what are the objectives? When did it begin? What has it achieved? What are some examples? How can it be addressed? What's going on right now? What's going to happen in the future? I mean, how do you see those issues?
Yes, the propaganda campaign on the United States is very active by promoting the program of Бессмертный полк, if you know, the program of May 9th, victory of the Soviet Union over the fascism, and the last conception that fascism was overcome not by United States or allies of Russia, but Russia itself, without any support. It's one of the stages of the propaganda campaign. And but mostly they are working in, special forces, they are working in the United States mostly for the laundering money. They don't want to create some problems for them. And I think that some of them, Kremlin team, they see their future in the United States, and they prepare their base here, and they don't want to create problems for the future invasion, let me say here.
Mm-hmm. So this brings another audience question that former Foreign Minister Kosyrev, who's also a US resident now apparently, said that the only way of really hurting the Russian elite is to block their access to their fortunes, including real estate, which is often in the Great Britain and the United States. Do you agree with that? And why haven't the US and the UK acted more forcibly to kind of block the fortunes of the Russian elite?
It's very dangerous because we are speaking about criminals who are trying to save their power, save their money, not only in Great Britain, but here it's dirty money, criminal money. And I think it's a problem of criminal money are dangerous not only because they have very stamps on it, but because owners of the criminal money are criminals. And to defend country more effectively is necessary to fight with criminals, with criminal money too, with laundering money, with, it's very, very light, very primitive point of view that money doesn't smell. In this case, it's their smell, yeah, they smell too much, and they create a lot of problems here in the United States. Now it's created already a lot of problems in Britain, criminal money. Yes, it's subjects need to be observed.
Mhm. And one final question, I think we may not have time for more than this because we're going to try and wrap up right at 5:15. But you know, considering the current situation, many people are worried. I mean, you could say this was a propaganda war in a way that a lot of people say Putin wanted to get a lot of attention for himself and attention for his complaints about how the West has mistreated Russia. But you know, a lot of people at this point are concerned about war breaking out. What do you think of the prospects? Like, will war break out, in fact, over Ukraine? Of course, acknowledging that there has been a war in Ukraine for 8 years, a more low intensity conflict in the East. But do you think a bigger war will break out? And if not, what's the end game, both for Putin and for the West? How are they going to kind of overcome that crisis?
I think it's not normal when in the center of Europe, one country occupied big territory of another country. But now we are speaking not only about Ukraine, but about Moldova, about Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and about other countries, and it has to be resolved. It's very stupid position that it will resolve but itself. If you remember, after their Georgian war in 2008, was reached the agreement between Medvedev and Sarkozy that Russia will leave Georgia. But it didn't happen. And the same thing with Abkhazia, the same thing with Pridnestrovia. And but the main problem now, it's Putin. And to feed wild animal like we see it now by supporting his activity, his interest, his behavior, it's very dangerous. I think that the main point now is Putin. And when leaders of the West are trying to reach an agreement with him, with criminal power, it's much more dangerous than to fight with him. Sometimes we have to be strong. We have to defend our interest, our democracy, our freedom. And no way without using military force, unfortunately.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, for a fascinating presentation. We look forward to further volumes of your book about the ongoing sort of campaign, disinformation campaign of Russia versus the West, and the kind of, I think that the book has another theme, honestly, which is this kind of question that you ended on how to manage the relations with a power that is not necessarily rational and pragmatic, but is actually, as you say, sort of criminal and often destructive, self-interested and destructive, right? That it can't necessarily be approached in the same way as one might approach, a different kind of opponent, So, so we're appreciative for you sharing your insights about that. And thank you for coming to Perry Worldhouse and to the University of Pennsylvania. Russian and East European Studies Department really thanks you for this illuminating portrayal. And I'm going to hand it over to, I guess, Michael Horowitz, I think, for the last couple of words. Maybe not. Okay, well, maybe I got that wrong. Apologies, everybody. So I'm going to thank you on behalf of Perry Worldhouse and on behalf of the Department of Russian and East European Studies. We periodically want to get and do get leading experts and practitioners of politics from Russia to speak about issues and to give a different insight into the types of questions that we often discuss. And we've certainly got that tonight or this afternoon. And I really appreciate Mr. Konstantin Borovoi for spending your time with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, and I can also mention that there are, we invite people to sign up for the Perry Worldhouse mailing list to be advised of other events. In next week, there's a book talk on reconsidering reparations, future challenges for the U.S. Army. As you know, a number of events that are always here, Perry Worldhouse, and of course, Russian and East European Studies. We have other seminar series lined up for this spring on a variety of topics on historical memory and on contemporary issues. So we look forward to your participation in those as well. Thank you so much again. And I really hope that at some point next time we'll be able to see you here in Philadelphia. And good afternoon to you. Good evening.
Thank you.